let's start with what you know about the mind. I think it's pretty certain to say that you all know the mind looks something like this. I'm also pretty certain to say that each one of you can draw this much better than I can. You probably also know that it is full of firing neurons. You probably don't know there's 100 billion of them. It probably doesn't matter. You may also know that the power actually isn't in the individual firing neuron, but instead the power is in the little synapse. The fact that lemon is connected to sour, stoves are connected to hot, chocolate's connected to delicious. The power is actually in all those connections. That's how we learn, that's how we generate meaning. You may also be aware of these things called cognitive biases, which are these seemingly irrational behaviors, made famous by the Dan Ariely's of the world. These connections sit deep in our brainstem, and they probably come from, as best we understand, explained as a carryover from thousands of years ago when these connections were absolutely essential and we needed fast reactions. But it's things like the confirmation bias, the very fact that when new information comes into us, we have a tendency to try to discard it if it doesn't fit with our current way of thinking. You may also be aware that we are of two minds. Now, I don't mean two brains, I mean two mental operating systems. There is our conscious, which is slow, deliberate, and effortful. Think of learning a new sport or learning a new language. Je m'appelle Anne. It's all very slow and deliberate. The other mind, as I call it, is the non-conscious processor. It is fast, automatic, and effortless. Je voudrais aller en vacances à Paris. We do it without thinking. The problem lies in the fact that economic theory for our lifetimes has been built on the premise that our conscious processor drives action. It's now been at least 20 years since that has been disproven, but us as marketers have been sitting in the dark. And it's not surprising that because marketing theory is built on economic theory, that we have spent our careers listening and talking to the conscious mind because that's what we thought drove action. But it's actually the non-conscious processor that drives the action. So what do I wish marketers actually knew that economists have known for a long time? I wish marketers knew three things. First, that our mind is associative. We make sense of the world by connecting incoming data to that's what's already in our memories. My favorite story about this is when my son was 3 and a friend of mine drove up to the house in a convertible. My son had never seen a convertible before, and he looked at the convertible, and then he turned to me with this confused look on his face. I didn't really know what was going on. And then he turned back to the convertible, and then he turned to me with the biggest smile on his face. And he said, "Look, Mommy, a car with no hat." And in that instance, he demonstrated and made visible to me how our minds work, because we can only make sense of the unfamiliar by connecting them to the familiar. And we're taking in that data and making sense of it by connecting it to what we know at an enormously fast rate. We are taking in 11 million bits of data every second, coming in through all of our 5 senses. But it's important to recognize that we are a visually dominant species. Of all these sort of connections over here in our mind, these connections ideas, by the way, the scientific word for them is images. They're called images. So the fact that we know what a peach tastes like, or what it looks like, or what it feels like, that is actually named as an image. 2/3 of all those images are actually pictures, which speaks to why we are visually dominant. It's the sense that we are most confident in. And if there's ever a confusion between what we taste and what we see, what we hear and what we see, we will always defer to our sense of sight, which is, by the way, why the idea of green tomato sauce is a very bad idea. You see green and it instantly triggers thoughts about not right, about vegetables, about everything that's the antithesis of ripe red tomato sauce. Okay, the second thing I wish that all marketers understood is that our thoughts are primarily, sorry, having a tough time writing this morning, beneath our level of awareness. As Tom mentioned, we like to use an iceberg as a metaphor for our mental operating system. And it's just this teeny tip at the top that we actually can see, yet all the power is beneath the surface. Scientists like to argue just how tiny that visible portion is, but it's fair to say it is less than 5%, which is pretty frightening because that's where we've been focusing all of our efforts. The 95% and more that sits beneath our level of awareness, we cannot access it, nor can we control it. It is built through repetition, which is why when you heard green tomato sauce, you could come over here. What was happening was, the neurons that were firing were everything you think about green as it relates to the context of fruits and vegetables. And you're thinking, not right. Definitely not going to taste good. I'm not going to like this. That is the case. And that is why our non-conscious processor is where we live. It is our home. It is the seat of all our experiences, all our memory, because they're all sitting down in our non-conscious processor down here where we have built all those experiences and all those memories. The third thing that I wish marketers understood is that decisions are primarily a function of feelings, not conscious deliberation. What happens is that our feelings and our emotions are a signaling system to communicate information between our non-conscious processor and our conscious processor, giving us indications. Should we move closer? Should we move back? Do we like it? Do we not like it? So what was happening when I was talking about green ketchup, and if I could have seen all of you really closely, I'm sure I would have seen sort of a visceral reaction saying, I don't think so. Because you're basically, your non-conscious processor was saying, stop, nope, not really interested in that. Because you're going all the way back here to where you had learned over your history that green and vegetables and tomatoes don't go well so well together. Now, I do not want to suggest that we do not use our cognitive processor to make decisions, because we absolutely do. And that's an input into it. And there are two critical functions that they take. One is it's a filter. That's too big, that's too expensive, that's the wrong color, very much guides our decision making. It's a very powerful, important filter. It's also a very important way that we post-rationalize. We have to make sense of the decisions we make or that are driven by our non-conscious processor, and our conscious processor is terrific at building that story. If you think back to the last piece of great new technology you needed, think to the story you told yourself as to why you needed it, but you needed that story because that's what kept us from having a disconnect between our cognitive or a conscious and our non-conscious. So these 3 points and the basic science about how the mind works is a really powerful lens to think through marketing decisions.